Under a sky bruised with thunder, the streets of Florence pulsed with the kind of energy that warned of more than just rain. The storm wasn't just weather, it felt personal, almost prophetic. And as the first droplets kissed the cobblestones, Ethan stood frozen before the glass window of a tiny art gallery tucked between aged stone walls and the lingering scent of espresso. There it was, a poster announcing an exhibition, but not just any exhibition, his exhibition, or at least, it should have been. The name printed in bold serif letters wasn't his. It read, Marcus Delaney, the same Marcus who had once shared his apartment, his wine, and his dreams of making it as an artist. The same Marcus who Ethan had trusted with his most intimate concepts, his rawest sketches, and the deepest layers of his artistic soul. 3 weeks ago, they had both submitted proposals to a curator known for discovering rising stars. Ethan's submission was a masterpiece in grief and beauty, a series that fused the broken elegance of classical sculpture with the vulnerable chaos of modern heartbreak. The curator had quietly hinted that Ethan's work was among the most moving she'd seen in years. He had every reason to believe this would be his first major breakthrough. But now, this? Marcus had taken the very idea Ethan poured his soul into, mirrored the themes, mimicked the textures, even mimed the names of the pieces. It wasn't just plagiarism, it was betrayal on a level that cracked something inside. Ethan, he didn't know, could break. His fingers curled against the cold glass. Behind it, he saw guests arriving, sipping wine, laughing under dim lights. Applause echoed faintly as someone clinked a glass to make a toast. A part of him in ancient, angry parts, creamed to march in, call Marcus out, expose the truth, burn the lie to the ground. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked into the darkening streets, into the rain. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one in his chest. Rage, shame, confusion. How could someone he loved, someone he trusted, twist the knife so deeply? And why? Why did Ethan still crave revenge? He wandered aimlessly through alleys until the city blurred into shapes and sounds. That's when he found the bookstore. It was tucked away behind an iron gate and a cracked wooden sign that read Antici Libre. He stepped inside, led by something he couldn't name, instinct, maybe, or destiny. The place smelled of dust, history, and forgotten truths. He ran his hands along the spines, not looking for anything in particular, until one title caught him. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Marcus, that name again. It stopped him cold. He opened the book, his eyes landing on a line that would alter his life forever. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. The air seemed to still around him. That one sentence shattered the loop of rage running wild in his mind. Not because it made the pain disappear, but because it handed him a mirror, a challenge, a way out. He bought the book, walked back to his small apartment, soaked in rain and silence. He didn't go to the exhibition. He didn't confront Marcus. He didn't scream. He read. And that night, something inside Ethan shifted. The pain remained, but it was now accompanied by a flicker of clarity, a seed, a choice. He could become consumed by vengeance, or he could become untouchable. That's how this story begins, not with revenge, but with restraint, not with a take, but with a transformation. And if you've ever been betrayed, hurt, or pushed to the edge, you're going to want to hear how this ends. So if this story pulls something inside you, some echo of your own battles, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life, filled with the fire, the lessons, and the healing that we all need. Now, let's spark a conversation. If you were in Ethan's shoes, what would you have done? A. Confront Marcus and expose him publicly. B. Walk away and focus on your own growth. Drop your answer in the comments, A or B, and let's see how you would choose your power. The silence in Ethan's apartment was no longer empty, it was sacred. After that night with the book in his hands and the betrayal behind him, Something subtle but seismic had begun to shift. The rainstorm had passed, but what remained was a storm within a tension between who he had been and who he might become. He didn't just read Meditations, he devoured it. Slowly, deliberately. Each page peeled back another layer of noise that had lived rent-free in his mind for weeks, and, with every ancient line, Ethan began to see that the real battle wasn't with Marcus. It never was. The real war was inside. The expectations he had carried, the ego that had demanded justice, the identity he had attached to recognition. So he began a new practice. Each morning, before the city stirred, he lit a single candle and wrote, not sketches or plans, but reflections, honest, unfiltered thoughts. He wrote about the betrayal, yes, but also about his fears, his doubts, and the raw ache of feeling small in a world that didn't always reward fairness. In the beginning, the journal entries were sharp and messy. He cursed, he cried, he blamed, but then something fascinating happened. His words grew quieter, more curious, less about Marcus, more about Ethan, less about what was done to him, more about what he could learn from it. He began to ask himself, why did this wound cut so deep? What part of me needed that exhibition so badly? Why did I give Marcus the power to ruin my peace? It was through those questions that Ethan began to truly understand what the Stoics had been teaching for centuries. You cannot control what others do. You cannot demand justice from a world that is not obligated to be fair. But you can control your inner state. You can meet chaos with calm. You can choose not to be broken by things that are out of your hands. The shift didn't make the pain vanish. It just made space for something else. Growth. Each morning walk through the city became an extension of this internal discipline. He no longer wandered aimlessly, consumed by what had been taken from him. He walked with presence, absorbing the architecture, the way sunlight touched the Duomo, the voices of tourists marveling at beauty he had stopped noticing when he was angry. Ethan realized he had missed so much of life in those weeks spent in resentment. He began practicing negative visualization, a Stoic tool that felt counterintuitive at first. He imagined losing everything again, his art, his home, even his health. But instead of feeling fear, he found gratitude. He saw clearly how much he still had, how much he had overlooked in his quest to prove something. Ethan's sketching returned, too, but not with urgency. He no longer chased perfection or recognition. He drew as a form of meditation, tracing emotions onto paper without judgment. His lines softened, his subjects changed. Less about struggle, more about acceptance. He also stopped speaking about Marcus altogether, not out of denial, but because he no longer needed to retell the story. It had served its purpose. Marcus had given him a kind of unintentional gift, a forced descent into darkness that introduced him to a deeper light. The Stoics believed in facing yourself first, before facing the world. Ethan was learning this in real time. He had always thought strength was about control of outcomes, of others, of appearances. But now, he saw it for what it really was, surrendering to what is, and finding peace there. He wrote on a slip of paper and pinned it to his wall, "You suffer more in imagination than in reality." Seneca's words, a quiet, daily reminder. And when the doubts returned, as they sometimes did, he no longer resisted them. He welcomed them like familiar travelers. He knew now that discomfort wasn't the enemy. Complacency was. Through it all, Florence became a mirror to his internal world. The city hadn't changed, but he had, and so it looked different now. Softer, slower, more alive. Ethan hadn't forgiven Marcus, not yet, but he had forgiven himself for the ways he reacted, for the ways he clung, for the ways he gave away his peace. And that, he realized, was the first real victory. There comes a moment in every healing journey when reflection is no longer enough. Ethan had spent weeks plumbing the depths of his inner world, questioning, journaling, finding perspective. But now, Something inside him urged forward motion. He no longer wanted to simply understand his pain. He wanted to transmute it. He wanted to become someone even betrayal couldn't touch. That's when he began to build what he called his inner fortress. It wasn't about shutting the world out. It wasn't about becoming cold or unreachable. It was about becoming grounded in a way that no storm could shake. About being so internally anchored that no insult, no lie, no failure could breach the peace he was cultivating. Ethan redesigned his entire day around this idea. He began waking at dawn not out of obligation, but as a declaration. The first hour of the day was his sanctuary. He practiced breathwork before sunrise, a steady ritual that brought him back to his body, to the present, to stillness. Then he trained nothing extreme, but deliberate movement, stretching, push-ups, walking uphill through the winding streets of Florence. The physical discipline became a metaphor for the internal one. Resistance was the path. Effort was the offering. He prepared his meals with care, slowing down to notice taste, temperature, gratitude. He turned his phone off for long hours, traded social media scrolls for pages of Stoic philosophy, art books, and ancient poetry. He limited his words during the day, choosing to listen more, react less. And when challenges came, as they inevitably did, he paused, then responded with calm instead of impulse. Little by little, he became less reactive. Where once he might have spiraled into overthinking or anger, now he simply observed. The same old emotions arose, but he met them differently. He was no longer a man at the mercy of circumstance. He was a man with a compass. People around him noticed the shift. A local painter, once dismissive of his style, now asked for his opinion. A student from his former workshop told him, "You're the calmest person I've ever met." Ethan didn't crave these compliments, but they confirmed something powerful. Transformation doesn't need to be announced. It radiates on its own. What Ethan learned in the process was this: to become untouchable isn't to armor yourself against life, it's to root yourself so deeply in principle, in clarity, in self-respect, that external chaos no longer has authority over you. The fortress within isn't built overnight. It's built brick by brick. A disciplined thought, an aligned action, a moment of self-restraint. It's refusing to gossip when the room tempts you. It's declining the urge to one-up someone's success. It's letting someone else take credit when you no longer need it. Every decision that honors your integrity is another stone in the wall. Ethan no longer feared Marcus or what had happened. In truth, he barely thought about him anymore. Not because he had forgotten, but because Marcus no longer defined anything about him. The past had become a teacher, not a tormentor, and that difference was everything. He found joy again in creation, not to prove anything, but because it felt good to bring something beautiful into the world. His studio filled with soft light and cleaner canvases. He explored color with freedom, no longer obsessing over whether his work would be seen, liked, or sold. The process had become the reward, and every time doubt crept in, every time a sliver of the old wound whispered, "What if this happens again?" Ethan would smile quietly and return to his breath. He was no longer building his peace on external promises. He was building it on something far more durable: his own values. The Stoics spoke of the inner sanctuary of mind and spirit that no enemy can reach. Ethan understood now. It wasn't a place you escaped to. It was a way of being you brought with you, everywhere. A state of presence, a refusal to give your power away, even in the face of cruelty. In that sense, becoming untouchable wasn't about superiority. It was about sovereignty. He wrote once in his journal, "I am not here to control others. I am here to master myself." And that, more than any comeback, was the real revenge. Stillness, Ethan learned, wasn't the absence of motion, it was the presence of choice. It was in the quiet moments between stimulus and response that his true strength was forged. He had built his fortress, strengthened his foundation, and reclaimed his energy. But there remained one final layer of refinement, learning how to master the pause. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A conversation that once would have provoked him now ended with a breath. An email laced with passive aggression was met not with a furious reply, but with silence. Ethan began noticing that the world often expected him to react. When someone poked, provoked, accused, it wasn't about the moment. It was about pulling him out of his center. And now, he refused to hand that power over. He practiced this discipline everywhere. In cafes where baristas forgot his order. In crowded trams, when someone stepped on his foot without apology. In daily interactions with egos louder than their talents. In every instance, he held back not out of fear or suppression, but out of deep awareness. He understood now that true strength isn't loud. It doesn't rush to defend itself. It observes, it decides, and when it speaks with intention. Then came the real test. It happened on a golden afternoon in Florence, during an art workshop held in the courtyard of an old monastery. Artists gathered with their easels and ink-stained fingers, and Ethan had been invited to lead a short session. He was mid-sentence, discussing contrast and form, when a familiar voice broke through the crowd, a voice that once lived in his apartment, laughed at his jokes, shared his dreams. Marcus. Ethan. Single quotes. Breath hitched for a moment. That voice dragged up memories he hadn't visited in months. But unlike the first time, when the betrayal had crushed his ribs like glass, he didn't spiral. He stood still. Marcus walked into the courtyard, pretending to be casual, but his eyes gave him away, uncertain, testing the waters. Ethan turned toward him, nodded once, then continued teaching. No change in tone, no tightness in his jaw. The moment had come and passed. He was untouched. After the session ended, Marcus approached. There was something hollow in his smile, something rehearsed in his words. "Your work's really evolved," he said, scanning Ethan's latest piece. "You found your voice." Ethan looked at him, calm and steady. "Thanks." "Nothing." "More." He didn't need to bring up the past. He didn't need to remind Marcus of what he'd done, or what Ethan had lost. The silence said it all. And what's more, it protected Ethan's peace. Because in that pause, that sacred moment of self-restraint, Ethan realized he had become someone entirely different. He was no longer a man shaped by his wounds, but one guided by his values. That evening, as the light faded and the courtyard emptied, one of the younger artists asked him, "How did you stay so calm when he showed up?" Ethan smiled, remembering the years of self-inquiry, the mornings spent journaling, the discipline of letting go. "Stillness isn't passive," he said. "It's a decision. Every time I stay silent when I want to scream, I choose who I'm becoming." He had learned the most powerful act wasn't speaking, it was knowing when not to. Not out of fear, but out of alignment. To hold your truth so deeply within that you don't need to explain it to anyone. To know who you are so completely that the noise of others becomes irrelevant. And in mastering that pause, Ethan unlocked a different kind of freedom. One that didn't depend on justice, apologies, or explanations. It was internal. It was unshakable. Florence continued to buzz around him, artists chasing acclaim, critics whispering, success measured in exhibitions and write-ups. But Ethan moved through it all like a man who no longer needed to be seen. He had become what the Stoics described in ancient pages: composed, deliberate, grounded. Stillness was no longer a tool. It was who he was. Victory, Ethan realized, wasn't what he once thought it was. It wasn't applause or vindication. It wasn't reclaiming a stolen spotlight, or hearing someone finally say, "You were right." That version of victory was shallow, fleeting, a sugar high that fades as quickly as it hits. Real power didn't roar, it whispered. It settled into your bones. It lasted. 4 months, he had labored not just over his craft, but over his character. He had learned how to hold his center, How to say no without explanation. How to speak only when it served truth rather than ego. The fortress within had become his real masterpiece, far more enduring than any painting he could hang in a gallery. But there was still a lingering question. If he no longer needed to win in the traditional sense, then what did winning actually look like? It revealed itself not in one grand moment, but in a series of small, quiet affirmations. Like when a stranger visited his studio and, moved by a piece, whispered, "I've never felt seen like this before." Or when a letter arrived from an emerging artist who had found Ethan's work online and wrote, "You made me believe I could survive betrayal too." No gallery lights, no critics' praise, just real people feeling something real. That was impact. That was legacy. Meanwhile, Marcus's name floated through conversations occasionally, often tethered to tension. Some whispered that his work had grown cold, derivative. Others noted he seemed more performative than passionate. Ethan never contributed to these conversations. He had no interest in diminishing Marcus to elevate himself. That wasn't the Stoic way. That wasn't his way anymore. One afternoon, at a group exhibition hosted in an old villa outside Florence, Ethan's name was listed beside artists he had admired for years. His section was modest, just 3 pieces, but the presence they carried was undeniable. Each painting held a stillness, a truth that couldn't be imitated. They weren't about revenge. They were about rebirth. Someone approached him that evening, a curator from Rome. "You have something others try to fake," she said. "You're not selling a brand, you're showing a life lived." Ethan smiled, not out of pride, but because she saw what mattered. He no longer measured success by external validation. He measured it by his ability to remain aligned, especially when no one was watching. Every day he stayed consistent in his values. Every time he chose patience over pride, integrity over impulse, that was a victory. And unlike fame, no one could take that away from him. A friend once asked if he ever regretted not exposing Marcus, not fighting back when he had the chance. Ethan paused, then answered honestly, double quotes, "No. Because the moment I chose growth over vengeance, I stopped being his shadow." He didn't need to compete. He didn't need to win in the eyes of the world. He had already won where it mattered most, within. His art began to carry that energy. It wasn't loud or attention-seeking. It didn't beg for validation. It invited contemplation. It gave viewers room to feel their own truths. And that, more than anything, made Ethan's presence impossible to ignore. Power, he had discovered, is not the ability to overpower others. It's the ability to stay in your peace when others try to pull you out of it. It's the courage to keep showing up for yourself, even when the world offers no applause. It's in the decision to create anyway, to love anyway, to rise anyway. That is the kind of victory that doesn't expire. And Ethan, quietly, with his sleeves rolled up and his spirit unburdened, kept choosing it day after day. Florence had given Ethan more than he could have asked for: pain, clarity, growth. But as the summer turned to early autumn and the golden light stretched longer in the evenings, he felt it deep in his chest. It was time to move on. The city that had once mirrored his heartbreak now reflected his strength, and though he loved it still, he knew he no longer needed it to feel whole. He planned a final exhibition, not to make a statement, but to mark the end of a personal chapter. It would be quiet, reflective, just a few pieces, curated with intention. He reserved a small gallery tucked near the Ponte Vecchio, the same place he had walked past countless times when he felt lost. Now, those same stones welcomed him like an old friend. The centerpiece of the show was unexpected, a nearly blank canvas. A faint circle marked its center, so subtle it could be missed if you weren't paying attention. Beneath it, a handwritten note read, "Forgiveness is not agreement, it is release." People entered the gallery slowly that night, walking past the finished works. the subtle lines and rich tones of his newer paintings, but they all stopped at the blank one. Some furrowed their brows, others stood in silence, a few wept. They didn't need to understand it intellectually. They felt it. Letting go, Ethan had learned, is not an act of weakness. It's an act of radical courage, to release the hope of a better past, to set down the weight of a story that no longer defines you, and above all, to stop asking for closure and become your own. As the night progressed, Ethan moved through the room with calm gratitude. He greeted friends, exchanged soft laughs, shared long silences, and then, just as he was helping refill glasses at the back table, he noticed him. Marcus. He hadn't seen him since the workshop months ago. Marcus entered the room slowly, looking older somehow. Tired, maybe. Their eyes met from across the gallery. No tension rose in Ethan's chest, no urge to retreat or confront. Just awareness. Marcus stopped in front of the blank canvas. He stood there for a long time, longer than anyone else had. He read the note beneath it, and then did something Ethan didn't expect. He bowed his head, as if in silent recognition. No words, no drama. Just presence. That, Ethan thought, was enough. There would be no apology, no confession. But there didn't need to be. The man Ethan had been angry, wounded, lost had long since shed his skin. What remained was someone who no longer measured his peace by someone else's regret. After the show ended, Ethan walked alone through the familiar streets. The city glowed with a quiet magic, and everything felt suspended in time. The river shimmered in the moonlight. The wind moved gently through the arches. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel finished, but he felt free. The next morning, he packed lightly, his sketchbooks, a few clothes, and the well-worn copy of Meditations. As the train pulled away from Florence, bound for Rome, Ethan watched the city fade into the distance. He didn't know what the next chapter would hold. He didn't need to. What mattered was this: he had let go of revenge, of needing to be understood, of holding tight to what had been done. And in that release, he had found his power, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not win. It's not prove. It's not punished. It's to walk away with your dignity intact, your heart unburdened, and your spirit whole. You don't need revenge. Just become so whole, so grounded, that they can't touch you anymore. Ethan's story isn't just about betrayal. It's about transformation. It's about what happens when the world wounds you in the places you trusted most, and you choose not to bleed on others, but to heal yourself instead. From the rainy streets of Florence where the sting of betrayal first hit, to the quiet strength of an inner fortress built with discipline, clarity, and grace, Ethan's journey became a masterclass in what it means to rise without revenge. He could have lashed out. He could have exposed Marcus, demanded justice, made a scene, but instead, he did something far harder. He turned inward. He faced himself first. He questioned his own need for validation, his expectations of loyalty, his illusions of fairness, and in doing so, he reclaimed something far more valuable than an art show or a reputation. He reclaimed his peace through journaling, daily rituals, physical discipline, and an unwavering commitment to growth. Ethan slowly became untouchable, not because he stopped feeling, but because he stopped being controlled by those feelings. He didn't become numb. He became deeply rooted. That's what made him powerful. When Marcus reappeared, the old emotions resurfaced, but Ethan didn't flinch. He paused. He chose stillness. That moment, so small and subtle, was the ultimate victory. He had become the kind of person who didn't need to win the way the world defines it. He had won by walking away intact, and in the end, he let go. Not because Marcus deserved forgiveness, but because Ethan deserved freedom. He created a final piece that said it all, without saying a word. A quiet, blank canvas with the message: forgiveness is not agreement. It is release. That's what we're really talking about here. Release. Letting go isn't weakness. It's strength in its purest form. It's saying, I'm not carrying this anymore. I'm not poisoning my present with my past. That decision repeated every day in the small choices of how we speak, how we react, how we show up is what makes us untouchable. So what can we learn from Ethan's journey? It's this. We don't control what happens to us. We only control what we do with it. And when life hits us where it hurts most, when someone betrays, deceives, or disappoints, we have two choices. We can let that moment define us, or we can let it refine us. Ethan chose the latter, and so can we. In your life, maybe you've been hurt. Maybe you've been overlooked, stolen from, misunderstood, or left behind. Maybe someone took something you worked hard for, or shattered a trust you believed was unbreakable. You have every right to feel that pain, but don't let it become your home. Let it be your teacher. Let it be your path. Build your inner fortress, not from anger, but from alignment. Create, move, reflect, grow, and in time, without even trying, you'll become so centered that the things which once broke you won't even touch you anymore. If this story moved something in you, inspired you, or made you see your own struggles differently, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating stories that don't just entertain but transform.